Oh my goodness. Oh, goodness gracious. He may look serious on the screen, but he's actually funny behind the scenes. My guest, Dr. Dan Schneider, one of the fan favorites, is back because we're going to talk about a topic today that all of you watching are familiar with. It's a topic on suffering, and you're like, we're going to talk about the value of suffering. What is it? And how does God see it? How does Satan try to use it? And as you may know, and he's got a huge bio, but I just wanted to ask, the important parts to remember is that he is a professor of theology at Franciscan University. He's an author. He's currently elbow deep in his next book, which I'm not going to tell you what it is yet, but the one that you've written recently, Dan, is the Liber Christo Method the most recent book, or did you have one right after that?
That's my most recent, yes.
So do you have that one right next to you? Because I have it here, but I forgot to
Got
have it. So the Liber Christo Method, and it's actually a field manual for spiritual combat. I tell all of my married couples to get that, all the people that are struggling to save their marriage, and everyone in between when they talk to me about things. I have families that come to me that are estranged from a daughter or a son or a sibling, and I say, you need to start with this book. So, and one last thing is he wrote that book because Dr. Dan Schneider is I'm going to say in layman's terms, he's an exorcist's assistant. I don't know if there's a formal title for you there, Dan, but I know you work with Father Chad Ripperger, who is the most renowned exorcist in our country. And he, along with others, founded the Liber Christo Institute because there were just so many people asking about and needing exorcisms. And you're one of the guys that goes in and helps. And the book is about what it takes. So, did I get enough of the good stuff of your bio out
Fair
there?
enough. You hit the high points.
Hit the high
Yes.
points. Suffering.
Yeah.
You and I are actually, people don't think we're weird, but we are. You and I are both excited about this topic. Why should we be excited to talk about suffering?
Yeah. It ties into every aspect of what it means to be Christian. When Christ announced his that the Messiah would suffer, that they would hand over the Son of Man and he would suffer, Peter says, God forbid, that shouldn't happen. So the one he had just made, what we would consider the first pope, he then turns around within the same conversation, calls him Satan. So the essence, Satan by definition is anything satanic is that which militates against the will of God and that which militates against the cross. And then later, Jesus, when he explains in the resurrection, the post-resurrection narrative in Luke's gospel on the way to the road to Emmaus, he says, did not the Messiah, how slow of heart you are, hard of heart and slow to believe, did not the Messiah have to suffer? And so Jesus at that time explains, now there was the Messiah, the messianic prophecies centered, the most popular one at the time was, of course, centering around Jesus as the son of David who would rise as a political hero, as a military hero like David. And so the Jews at the time were looking towards redemption and a restoration of Israel and Jerusalem as the center of the world, as the dominant world power. And that's the Messiah. John the Baptist says, are you the Messiah, or should we look elsewhere? Although I think the Baptists had a much deeper understanding of what the Messiah was. I think the Baptists knew this second current of Messiah, which we read from Isaiah and the suffering servant. That the Messiah, there was among the rabbis at the time, they did see this second current of what the Messiah would be like, that he would suffer, he would embody the suffering of Israel and bring the nations in to the fold of God, the prophecy to the Gentiles. And so Jesus says, hey, guess what? I'm both a Davidic Messiah. I'm the Son of Man, the Son of God, but also I'm the suffering Messiah of Isaiah. And so Jesus himself says, that suffering is part of his identity as Messiah. And then he gives us a threefold command when he says that, and before we even get into the theology of St. Paul, a threefold command: if you wish to be my disciples, he says. He gives, and if you look at the Greek construction, the implication of the Greek means they're ongoing conditions. You must do three things in a continual and ongoing way. You must deny yourself continually, daily. You must pick up your cross daily, and then you must follow me daily. These are the threefold conditions of discipleship. And so we often think we're under this fantasy that if I become closer to God, then I will not have to suffer anymore. That's the lie that the devil tells us. Oh, see what happens? See what happens? See what happens when you follow Christ, you know? See what happens? He doesn't care about your suffering. That's the lie that he tells us. He preaches this in our ear. I think I told you the story of a guy. I was in Germany last year, and a guy had somehow said, "Oh, Father Ripperger guy, he's in Germany, so I need to see him." He drove like
Father
2 hours.
Ripperger guy, is that what they call
Father
you?
Ripperger's guy, yeah, he's in Germany, and he wanted to see me, and he drove like 2 hours, and I had just traveled across the pond, and I was up for like 27 hours. We had driven
Talk
up.
about suffering.
Oh, I was car sick and I was just miserable, you know. And this guy sits down and he starts complaining about his wife, and he starts complaining about his life and why I went from this church and they didn't like me because I was too conservative or traditional. So then I joined the traditional church, and then now things are getting worse. And I said, "Well, what makes you think they're going to get better?" He goes, "Well, I mean, you know, I do all the novenas and I do all this, I do all these prayers." I'm like, "Well, what makes you think you're not going to suffer? Because if you're going to follow the path of the crucified one, right? Whose heart was pierced, you're going to suffer as he suffered. That's the nature of Christianity. We find victory in suffering, and we look to the Alleluia on the other side of the cross. That we always have that hope, but we have to follow in his footsteps, you know." And he was complaining, "Oh, my wife, she doesn't listen to me. She doesn't respect me. And I know that you guys are always saying that wives need to respect their husbands, and I'm the head of household." I'm like, "Okay, so tell me about besides your kids being sick and you're not, and your wife not respecting you, what's wrong?" "Oh, she doesn't respect me." "Okay, when's the last time you looked at pornography?" "Oh, it's a
Three
long
three
time. It's
hours
been like
ago.
6 weeks.
Yeah.
6 weeks."
And he said,
"Oh,
that's a
really?
long
But your wife
time.
doesn't respect you." And he said, "Yeah, I thought, well, last time you smoked marijuana." "Oh man, it's been at least 3
10
weeks, so I
minutes.
don't do that anymore." I'm like, "Dude, do you think because you say a couple prayers, you start entering into a traditional Catholic community, and you think that now things are going to get better? You got to work on yourself. You got to put to death." St. Paul says, you got to put to death the old self so that the new man in Christ can come to life. And you're not going to do that. You can't put something to death just in your brain. It's got to engage the body and the bodily senses. And so we have this fantasy, like this individual, that we're not going to suffer. "Oh, I'm a Christian now. Everything's going to be good." Well, not really. Remember we were talking about, we're of similar age. You remember the original Jesus of Nazareth, with Ernest Borgnine was
Yeah.
the centurion, the original one that we watched it as kids, man. It was like on every Wednesday during
Back when
Lent.
Moses was alive, when you and I were born, right?
Yeah, yeah. Moses was just alive or had just died.
Teenager.
Yeah, he was a teen. Yeah, we were teenagers. So we were young, and there was this scene when Jesus calls the apostles, and they're all kind of hanging around the fire. Jesus isn't there, and Peter says something like, "Yeah, pretty soon we're going to get through this, like this mission of preaching and teaching with Jesus, and then we're just going to get back to our families, and everything's going to be good. It's going to be like it was before." And Matthew looked at him and he said, "Things will never be the same. What are you thinking?" You know? And so part of the transition from death to life, let's face it, we all are in the body of death, as St. Paul says. To
Right.
go from death to life, there's going to be suffering. And that's part and parcel. It's part of living in the post-fall, post-lapsarian man. After the fall of Adam, the effect is sin and death has entered into the human condition, and we have to now deal with that.
One of the first things I know, I always turn it to marriage, but I think the vast majority of people watching are married or want to be married or were married. And my standards will always have people, remember, these are the people whose spouses have left them, they're divorcing them, they're having affairs and whatever. And my standards are one saying, I'm waiting till they come back. Every single one of them, as probably any cross one carries, is said by at least, but usually it's more than 5 people, you deserve to be happy. God wants you happy. So one of the first things I do, Dan, in training them in this, my basic levels of spiritual warfare, right, is nowhere, not a single place in the Bible does it ever say that God wants you happy here on earth. In his perfect will, yes. In his permissive will, he constantly says what you just said. Pick up your cross and follow me. He never says to put down the cross. Never. And so when we get that base understanding, it's liberating. It is liberating, because when people are like, no, you got to pick it up. You'll get to put it down the day you die. It'll be so exciting. And then I start painting the picture. I'm like, you carried it, you dragged it, it's blooding your shoulders like it bloodied Christ. You sob, you can't stand it. You got an ounce of strength left. And when you fail and you finally put it down on that day of your death, everything opens up. The weight is gone. You never have to carry it again. And, assuming heaven, purgatory package, right? Whichever part of those you're in anyway, you're like, never again. And you're like, I'm so glad I carried that cross for 80 short years. Because for all of eternity, you'll never, ever, 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 ever again have to suffer.
Yeah,
And
and
that's
how many
the truth.
people have you run across in your field, psychology and counseling, in my field of working with cases of affliction? How many people in our own life experience, people have suffered tremendously, particularly physical sufferings, but other sufferings. And once they work through it and they conquer it and they come to the other side of it, they'll say that was the best thing that ever happened to me.
Every
And how could
single
somebody
time.
say, I was abused as a child, I was sexually abused, and it's made me who I am.
Yeah.
And I would not trade that because of this suffering. And I'm not belittling that. Don't get me wrong.
Correct.
Because you could insert your cross, insert your suffering, insert your trauma. But once you overcome that, it becomes something that becomes an instrument of grace. Like St. Paul says, where sin abounds, grace abounds all the more. And I think turning in from the subjective to the objective, and in the manual, the book that I wrote, I distinguished between trauma and violence. Christ suffered violence on the cross, objectively speaking. I mean, but he suffered no trauma. Trauma is subjective. It's our response. So how many people, that they experience a traumatic, psychologically and physical traumatic event, and they turn inward and it becomes poisonous. So suffering helps purify that by linking it to the sufferings of Christ. It takes it out of the realm of subjectivity, and it gives us Christ's suffering, his infinite suffering, because as only the God-man can, opens his side. What could it be? How could it be? How can he say it is finished, right? When St. Paul says in Colossians 1:24, I rejoice in my suffering, for in my body, I make up what is lacking in the suffering of Christ's body, which is the church. And in Philippians, I think it's 1:29, for you it is committed not only to believe in him, but to suffer for him, to suffer for Christ. How could it be finished? How could we be appointed to suffer? What is finished if Christ said, it is completed? What could be lacking if Christ said
Right.
it's completed? You see what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Except if not our own participation, his side was left open for our subjective participation in the distribution of the graces of Calvary. And so we become causes of the cause. Christ, the eternal cause, Christ, the ultimate cause, the primary cause. We become little Christ, little causes, and open up the distribution of those graces through our suffering. And this is why it's important, before I get into, in the manual, into lessons on spiritual combat, on how to directly engage the enemy, we have to first deal with the psychological wounds and the traumas. And how do we do that? We integrate our suffering into the objective suffering of Jesus Christ. And it's not just this epistemological mind game we're playing. We physically enter into that suffering.
How do you
Right?
do that? Right. But how do you do that? How do you physically
Very
enter?
practically, here's what I teach people
Yeah.
that come to us. Find somewhere in the Holy Triduum, Holy Thursday, Good Friday, Holy Saturday. So it starts again, and it starts and before you even get to suffering, you have to develop a prayer life, a life of mental prayer. That's another good topic that we can talk about, because spiritual combat and the battle, you overcome. Mental prayer is an absolutely critical portion, a critical part of it. This is why soldiers go on long forced road marches, to get them their bodies ready. This is why fighters do road work every morning, to get their bodies to have the endurance. So we have to start through mental prayer, entering into the words and deeds of Christ by meditating on sacred scripture. And so so we can start to take our trauma, even if it's just a short first initial act of the will, that we have to move it and find somewhere in that triduum, and link it. Lord, you suffered this, I offer it that. I offer this and I put it there. So we had a guy whose wife was possessed, okay? And there was all sorts of, whenever you're dealing with possessed people, there's all sorts of problems and accusations and enmeshment. And this is why we have clear rules with Father River. This is our, we run a very scientifically, very medical model. And so the guy was like, hey, now she's saying these things and now I'm being accused of this. And these are all these things I'm being accused of are not true. And and I'm getting angry about that. And I said, well, I can think about this guy who was a Jewish carpenter and an itinerant preacher, and he just came to help people, and they actually arrested him, and they made all sorts of false accusations against him. Do you know that guy? His name was Jesus of Nazareth. He's like, yeah. So when you feel the accusations that you're being accused, the spirit of mockery, the spirit of accusation, the spirit of condemnation is the demon just projecting this garbage into your brain. You go to Jesus with it. Lord, I stand here next to you, and you're being accused by the Pharisees, the religious leaders, the very people you came to help and to save, and they mock you. One year, you take a fair-skinned guy from Ohio, put him in the army, and I'm a runner, I'm an athlete, I was a boxer, so I did a lot of time in the sun, and so I had to get my skin looked at by a dermatologist, and so he put this stuff on my face, and it just, I don't know if you've ever seen people with this, it fries off the outer layer of skin, and it highlights all those areas that are precancerous, right? And so then they go in and they just, a week later, and they just fry every spot that's precancerous. And so I looked like somewhere between Quasimodo and the Crypt Keeper. Okay. I looked awful. And I didn't even want to go outside. It was awful. I was like, I was like, oh gosh, this is horrible. I'm gonna lay low and work from home for a couple of days. But I had to drop something off at the Carmelite monastery. And I dropped something off, and the sister that received me at the door goes, oh, what happened to your face? And I was like,
Thanks for
well,
noticing.
I'm like, thanks for noticing. And she said, and I said, yeah, I had this, dermatology and it's precancerous, blah, blah, blah. And she goes, oh, it's beautiful. I'm like, what do you mean? She said, today's Ash Wednesday. Now, every time that you look in the mirror, every time anybody looks at you because you look so horrible, you can remember all the times when Jesus was standing there, when his hands tied behind him and they spit in his face and it burned his perfect, pure humanity, and they rejected him with their spit. You can link your face to the face covered with spit of Jesus Christ. You can do that. This could be a good Lent for you. I was like, wow, wow, that's true. So learning to link our suffering to Christ's suffering. And it also engages us in the imagination and prayer, because what the demon is going to constantly do is do his other lie. Hey, this is what happens when you become more serious in your faith. This is what happens when you try to lead your family in prayer. This is what happens when you start praying every day. See what you get? God's not going to protect you. That's the lie that he gives us. And we break it by linking our suffering with Christ. And it becomes an act of the will, not just a mental. We're not playing mental calisthenics here. We're willfully saying, I surrender my will to you and I give it to you, Lord. Purify me in these things.
So if I say this in my blonde terms, right, bring it down. So what I'm hearing, and this is what I understand, this is what I think I actually do when I work with people, but now you're putting meat to this, is there's not a single thing, not a single tiny minuscule thing that anyone suffers that Jesus didn't, from health problems to, I mean, forgive my grossness, but when people have vomit and diarrhea, Jesus suffered all those, right?
Yeah, because St. Paul says, or Hebrews, and you can argue it,
Everything.
St. Paul wrote, I happen to think St. Paul probably wrote Hebrews, but the book of Hebrews says he was like us in all things except sin. St. Thomas comments, somebody asked that question, St. Thomas answers that question, did Jesus suffer sickness, bodily sickness. He had a perfect humanity. He had a preternatural humanity, so to speak. You know what I mean? It was a perfectly glorified humanity on earth. But St. Thomas says that he didn't have to, but he chose to
Yeah.
enter fully into the human condition. He knows what it's like to suffer sickness, bodily
Yeah.
hell, upset stomach, stubbing your toe. You
So
know,
when you have a child who's dying of cancer, not that Jesus ever had cancer, but he knows what it's like to watch a child suffer because, you know, we
even
are all
better.
his kids.
Exactly. So, but how do you link it to prayer? Who also in scripture had a child who suffered? Go to
Mary,
Jairus.
right?
Well,
Well,
Mary, of
yeah,
course.
all of
You
them.
can place yourself in Jesus. I'm like Jairus. My child is physically sick. My child is spiritually sick. They've abandoned the faith. Jairus gave you his 12-year-old daughter who was physically dead. I'm giving you my 28, my 40-year-old son who's spiritually dead. Lord,
Yeah.
help me. Help me.
So when
Right?
people are
You're
struggling
entering.
because they've been rejected, I say to them, that is the most painful. It's even more painful than loneliness. And I would say it's more painful than any physical pain you have too, because rejection means not only are you left alone, but I am choosing to leave you. I don't want to be around you. And so
Yeah.
Jesus, I'm like, go and look at that and look at, so it's not just like the crown of thorns and the whipping, it's those emotional things that you feel. My spouse disrespects me. Well, look at how we disrespected Christ, the name calling. And this isn't just in his not Gethsemane, those 3 days. And it was just not in
Yeah, the
his,
Triduum, yeah.
yeah, it's not just there, it's the 30 the 3
They were so
years.
angry, they tried to kill him, and he disappeared through their midst, you know?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So find somewhere in the life of Christ. I start with the Triduum because you can limit it to 3 days. But over time, as you begin to read the Word of God and you read Scripture, you know, the Gospels in particular, you begin to imbue your mind with the words of Christ. You now have a reservoir, because the way it works is that the demon has access to the data set in our memory and our imagination. You know, so you're not going to have the data set of desert, of combat and desert, and the images that I've got in my mind from back in those days when I was a soldier in the young days. I'm not going to have images of this or that. We all have our own data set, and this is, the enemy has access to that. So until we purify our memory and get custody of the imagination or the mind, so the mind is the pre-workings of what's in our our memory and our imagination. So all of our memories are built up into there, and it's like the Betty White commercial. You know what I mean? You're not yourself. You know,
The
when
Snickers
the Snickers
commercial.
commercial, and
Yeah.
Betty White shows up in the huddle and it's like, stop complaining. You know, you're not yourself when you're hungry. The demon can manipulate our imagination, and he can start projecting images, you know, of something cruel your husband said or did to you, or something, or your wife, or this rejection. And then once you appropriate that emotion, boom, now he's got you. This is why, you know, in our system, and I write about this in the book, you have to disappropriate the emotions. Now, when you're in a counseling session, great. You're going to talk about that, and hopefully you're not dwelling on that, but your counselor is teaching you, your mental health professional is teaching you, your spiritual director is teaching you, okay, let's look at the emotion. Now, what do you do with that emotion? How do you, you know, we say disappropriate it. Just separate it. How do you disappropriate it? Insert something from Christ. Break it down with prayer. Listen to this. Dr. Joe Lepetsky, I think you know Dr. Joe.
I
He
don't
is
actually.
he's a psychiatrist or psychologist that we work with. He's a part of our Father Ripperger's team of consultants for the psychological, and he trains our teams on the psychological interface between the psychological and the spiritual. So I was at a conference that he was giving last year, and he said something that was profound, that really stuck with me. He said, he was distinguishing, now I'm talking to you, so correct me where I'm wrong here, okay? There's a difference between front brain and back brain cogitation, right? Back brain is more big picture, it's more long-term, big concepts. Front brain is details, okay? So the demon is going to constantly, think of him pounding you in the back of the head, you know, hey, McFly, you know, just constantly pounding you. It's always going to be this way. You're never going to get out of this. Your spouse is always going to hate you because you've always been hated, because you're a loser. That's the diabolic. That's the talking snake. He's going to pound And he's going to use your memories. Remember that time? Remember what you did? God could never forgive that. You're scum to him. He'll never forgive you. That's the talking snake that's projecting into the back brain, and he's trying to get you to quit. And so Dr. Joe says that he cited a scientific study that says that 60 seconds of front brain cogitation, okay, detailed cogitation, just doesn't have to be, now we're not talking about prayer yet. We're talking about just engaging in the front brain. What you and I are doing right now, just back and forth engagement. 60 seconds has the same physiological effect on the body, on the brain, as one dose of antidepressant or anti-anxiety meds, right?
That's 10
So
minutes?
60 seconds
60
is the same.
seconds.
1 minute, 1 minute of front brain cogitation. Now,
And so again, I always say to my mom, because she's like, you talking big words. I love my mom. So when you're talking about 60 minutes is just mentally kind of focusing on that topic,
any
just
topic,
60 minutes
just engaging in
of the good part though, right?
detailed front, just detailed thinking, detailed cogitation, detailed interaction with something in detail. This is why after World War II, talk about crisis, mental health crisis we have now with the soldiers coming back. It's a huge issue. But after the Second World War, when the term shell shock came up, now we know it as PTSD. They would teach these men how to sew, right? They would how to so this engagement, the demon wants us to sit here like this and go, I can do this. I think I can figure this out. It's not going to work. He's going to pound you. It's like standing in the corner with Mike Tyson saying, if I just stand here long enough, he'll stop hitting me. He's just going to keep hitting you until you're dropped. And so they would teach men to engage with their bodies, to sew, to arrange flowers. It sounds really lame, but just this engagement, they're focusing their front of their brain on they're focusing their brain on that with their bodies, and now it snaps them out of that back brain where the PTSD dwells, right? You're never going to have this. Look at this image. Look what you saw. Look what happened to your buddy. You see? And so this is why we love the rosary as Catholics, because we're engaging our bodies, we're moving our lips, we're moving our fingers, right? And that becomes a focus of our bodies. The energy kind of, we focus our bodies here, and then our minds become free to meditate on the words and deeds in the life of Jesus Christ. This is what mental prayer is doing. And how do we do that vis-a-vis suffering? We have to now link our suffering with Christ's suffering. And we have to purify the data set in our imagination through mental prayer and custody of the intellect.
So when you're having a fight with your spouse, or when the devil is getting you, because I know sometimes when my husband and I all fight, the new me is like, in my head, I just start going, Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. And then I'll just do them over and over and over again. And I will notice that my demeanor changes and my cortisol drops. I'm calmer. And so the data set that's like, oh, he's being a jerk, and he's picking on you, and he's saying things you don't want to hear, or whatever you do when you fight.
He's this, he's that. That's not you.
Yes, which is Satan. And then so when you pull it out with the prayers, it quickly shifts it to truth, which is focusing on God, right? Yeah. So this is an active, this isn't just mental prayer. This is really an activity that we can do. Well, because people are always asking what to do. And I'm like, this is what to do. This is an activity.
Here's a key distinction. In the first draft of the book, Father Ripperger did the peer review. And I used the word surrender, the surrender to the will of God, that the Virgin Mary had perfect surrender. And he corrected me. And he said, in Catholic tradition, it's not surrender, it's conformity. And I thought, and then the next week I was meeting with the publisher to discuss the project, and we're not quite, I hadn't quite submitted it yet. And the guy hands me, says, hey, we got this extra book. It's an old book called Trustful Surrender to Divine Providence, written by, the second half of the book is Saint Claude de Colombier. It's a great book put out by TAN. I can send a link if you'd like. Trustful Surrender to Divine Providence. And so I was like, well, that says the word surrender. And so I read the book. It's a small little booklet. And it must be a translational issue from French to English, because the entire book is about conformity. When I was in the military, somebody could call me, my commander could call me into his office and say, Schneider, get over here. Boom, stand at attention. I want you to do this. And I don't want to do it. But I'd rather not go to Leavenworth and spend the
Right.
rest of my career in a military prison than do what this jerk is telling me to do. I'm going to do it. I'm going to surrender my will. And I'm going to knock this out. As I'm walking out, I'm cussing, I'm complaining to all the sergeants what a jerk the CO is. I can't believe he's asking us to do this, but just guys, just gut check and get this done. That's not conformity. That's surrender. That's different. I can surrender my will and yield to a higher power, a higher authority, but that's not the same. The grace is in conformity. It's accepting this because God has asked me to accept this. This is your husband. This is your wife. You chose this. And God put you together. This is your marriage. Conform now. Conform to this suffering. It's accepting this suffering because God wants it. So the entire booklet or book, it's a small book on conformity. It's about conforming our will to even the smallest little things. Because if I can't mortify myself when somebody cuts me off in traffic, right? You know, my kid's like, Dad, you're so intense. I can't believe you're so casual when you drive. Like, if anybody would be a road rager, it was you. But I laugh when somebody cuts me off and they tell me, I'm number one, I'm like, hey, how's it going? If I can't mortify those little things, when the big stuff comes, I'll never be able to. It's the little teeny things where grace is, and that God gives us opportunities for grace every day to deny the self, pick up the cross, and to follow him in the smallest things, waiting in line. Look, do as I say and not as I do, because it's hard for choleric temperaments to really just like, oh, no problem, I'll just kick back, I'll wait in line for the next hour, I got nothing else to do. I mean, it's hard. That's okay, the guy's being a jerk, no problem. It's hard, but it's mortifying that and letting God, letting grace flow from those moments of interactions. And when we can conform the will in the smaller things, when the big stuff comes, like marriage problems or life problems or health problems or whatever, we set the foundation to be able to live our Christian faith. Because if you can't do this, why bother being a Christian? Go become Baha'i, go become, some other religion where there's not suffering. What's the first principle of the Buddha? Life is suffering. And so you transcend it through meditation, and you alter consciousness to avoid the suffering. That's the whole point of Eastern mysticism.
Yeah.
It's to avoid suffering, right? That's Buddhism. Christianity says life is suffering. Pick up your cross and follow me, because you're going to be Christ, and the glory that awaits you in heaven is going to be great. You see the difference? We're not here to avoid.
Yeah.
We're here to pick up the cross, and it's hard.
I just got a very simplistic view. When you pick up your cross, your muscles are bigger. You're carrying it. You're like that worker, Little House on the Prairie, or watching Charles working on the more you do it, you're going to have bigger muscles, not by sitting there and watching your wheat fields get planted, but by planting the wheat fields, by getting the plow in there. And so let me ask you a question about like what I do, because I always have to use examples. And so I'll just go with my life because I think it'll apply to everybody else. So when I'm teaching people about standing, right, and I have said to them, do this novena of surrender. I don't think I was incorrect for doing so, but can you help me? Am I actually doing it right? Or should I be telling them to conform? Or is the act of saying no, just accept the suffering, actually helping to teach them conformity? Because I'm like, once you get surrendered, you're there.
It's going to be hard because you're not going to go, because we're not holy people. Let's face it. We're struggling. We're on the way. We're all in the process of becoming holy. We're trying to anyway. So at the beginning, it's just that little mortification of the will of surrender. You might grind your teeth. The first time you have to, the commander calls me in and, I grind my teeth and I cuss him out with the other guys. The next time he does it, yes, sir. And I do it. And everybody's like, hey, what's going on? What did he say? Nothing. This is what he wants to do. I don't complain, but interiorly, I still hate the guy. The third time I go in and I say, yes, sir. And the guys say, why are we doing it this way, sir? Well, because he wants it, and therefore we need to do it the way he wants it, because he's the commander. And now our commander is Jesus Christ. Our commander is God. He knows what's perfect for us. So that's, it's all analogies fell short, but we move along a continuum of conformity. And how do we do? The key is also detachment.
Yes.
If you're emotionally attached and you have psychological attachments to the way it should have been, right? The way it should be, the way he should be, the way she should be, the way my marriage should be, the way my kids should be at this moment. To the extent that we have psychological attachments, the demon can also work on that. He can pound away. So it's learning to be detached and conforming. Okay, Lord, I surrender.
That is so funny, because detaching, some of the time people say to me, wait a minute, because I'm like, all right, your child's estranged from you and detached, like, but I'm supposed to parent my children. Now, it's easier when they're adults for them to understand detachment, but when the child's younger and maybe a 10-year-old in the hospital with cancer, right? That the idea of teaching them to detach, it's like, wait a minute, I'm their provider. I'm supposed to be fighting for the health. I'm like, yeah, but there's a difference between I can't live without this child, don't take this child, or I'm going to fight for I'm going to be an advocate for his or her health care. But also, Lord, if you take my child, I'm detached because it's your child first. Same thing with a marriage, right? And I'm just
Right.
actually doing this so that you can tell me if I'm doing it right. I'm like, well, detach from your spouse. And like, well, wait, I'm standing for reconciliation. I said, I know, but I will tell you this. If you want your spouse to come back, he or she will not come back if you haven't detached. Not saying if you've detached that they will come back for sure, but the ones that do come back will not come back until you detach, which means to say to the Lord, I'm willing to give you my spouse. I'm going to do whatever you'll have me do to fight for my marriage, even if you tell me that on this side of heaven, they'll never come back and we'll never reconcile. That's true detachment. Am I doing it right?
Absolutely. Yeah,
Okay.
100%. And sometimes you have to engage your body to detach. I've had guys, people come to me I don't do counseling, but they'll say, hey, my wife and I are having a problem. And what prayer can here's what I always get. What prayer can I pray to fix this? So it's a sugary Jesus pill that I can take, pray this magic prayer, and then everything's going to be fine. And my wife's going to love me again and everything's going to be fine again. I said, there is no prayer. You have to surrender. Offer up all your communions, offer up every prayer, direct all fire, but you got to become a better man. Well, my wife doesn't want to be intimate with me. Yeah, well, because you're fighting. And intimacy right now is pretty revulsive to her. Okay,
Yeah.
so here's what you do. How about you turn the hot water off on your shower once in a while? How about you mortify your body and start mortifying those little pleasures and start reorienting your body towards holiness by mortifying your lower passions. So you're absolutely, I think what you're saying is perfectly correct. Getting people to be detached and know that there's so much grace there, so much grace. Here's another recommended reading. It's Pope John Paul II. Pope John Paul, two popes. I want to do a couple of quotes. One is, I would recommend this for anybody who's really suffering and once they really want to understand a philosophy and theology of Christian suffering. And it's a work that Jean Paul II wrote called Salvifici Doloris. On the redemptive value of suffering that's the Latin. Suffering, he says, is a vocation. He says Christ does not explain in the abstract the reasons for suffering, but before all else, he says, follow me, come, take part in your suffering in this work of saving the world, a salvation achieved through my suffering, through my cross. Gradually, as the individual takes up his cross, spiritually uniting himself to the cross of Christ, the salvific meaning of suffering is revealed before him. He does not discover this meaning at his own human level, but at the level of the suffering of Christ. At the same time, however, from this level of Christ's salvific meaning, suffering descends to a man's level and becomes, in a sense, the individual's personal response. It is then that the man finds joy, and he finds in his interior life peace and even spiritual joy. And he says, the discovery of the salvific meaning of suffering in union with Christ transforms the feeling of depression, of helplessness. So by entering into that, it overcomes this. And faith and sharing in the suffering of Christ brings with it the interior certainty that the suffering person completes what is lacking in Christ's afflictions, Colossians 1:24. The certainty that in the spiritual dimension of the work of redemption, he is serving, like Christ, the salvation and of his brothers and sisters. And he becomes, he says, a little mediator within Christ, capital M, highlighted, capital letters, once for all mediation. But we participate in the distribution of graces. Some people's vocation is Poor Clares and Carmelites. They suffer for the church, they suffer for the world. Our vocation is the married life. We offer all of our suffering towards our spouse and towards our children, all those things, and conforming, and in so doing, we conform to the will of God. And in that, he says, we discover spiritual peace and even joy.
So I've had a friend say to me, and it's funny because I've said it myself. She's like, yeah, I know that I'm never going to ask for suffering because I'm not there yet. I don't want to ask for it. I mean, it's like,
You don't have to ask for it. It's coming anyway.
right. It's like, I'm not there yet. I'm not going to ask.
Yeah.
But I got it because it's like, I didn't fully, okay. So to intellectually understand what you're saying, the stage of just asking for suffering when when the reward is not yet tangible is difficult to do. So you just kind of led into some, it's the peace. So there's a tangible reward. I also, and this is where I'm looking for, when I try to get people to understand the value of suffering, I use this phrase that for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. And that is true even for suffering, because in heaven, there are levels, right? We know that, St. Paul talks about the levels. And so I would believe, and if I'm incorrect, you've got to correct me here publicly, that those who suffer the most on earth have greater rewards in heaven. And those who receive that suffering more willingly have even greater rewards. So suffering is one thing, but receiving it is another. And so when someone believes that there's value in their suffering, tangible fruit, like if you receive this suffering, the offer it up for your poor souls in purgatory, but it's like, I'm going to offer this suffering for my neighbor who's an atheist, or I'm going to offer this up, and then I'll see something transform. I will receive a blessing. I will receive something. So is that true? And then how we can help people to see there is an absolute gift and a balance for the reception of suffering, the willing reception of suffering. Keep suffering because there's a payoff. Is that bad? Does that take away some of the?
What it sometimes could help us to understand if we have to mortify the fact that we may not see the fruit of it in this life.
But we will see it in the next life.
We'll see it in the next life.
There is fruit, right?
Theologically, yeah. Paul talks about levels of heaven. When he talks about, I saw there was once a man who was taken up into the third heaven. He's describing his own mystical experiences. And so theologically, the church kind of speculates, I think on good theologian speculation and over the developed tradition of the church, that every soul in heaven is filled to capacity with the beatific vision. So, but the size of the cup, the receptacle in heaven is going to vary depending on our life here on earth. So the analogy I remember a professor years ago said, think of John the Baptist and John Wayne. John Wayne married multiple times. Great guy. Don't get me wrong. He's a hero. I'm from Ohio, man. We love John Wayne. So he dies and has a deathbed conversion, right? Presuming his deathbed conversion, and received the sacraments, presuming that the graces, let's presume for a moment that he went through purgatory and is now purified and now in heaven. His cup is like this, John the Baptist, the greatest born among of women. His cup is
barrel.
It's one of those big water tanks that feeds the whole city. Everybody in heaven has a crown. The saints, Mother Teresa, Maximilian Kolbe, they've got crowns so big they got wheelbarrows pushing those, helping them push the crown. You and I, we might have a Burger King crown. But we're going to have a crown. Yeah. But their crown is a little nicer. We might have to spend a few days in crafts to bedazzle and put some glitter glue on our Burger King crown. But we're going to have a crown in heaven. So the extent that we offer ourselves now, the extent that we make ourselves, what does St. Paul says? Make yourselves a living sacrifice. And he's not talking about in our brains. He's talking about entering and engaging into the very mystery of Christ's suffering through our bodies. Paul says, in my body, I make up what's lacking in the suffering of Christ's body, the church.
So just to work with your analogy, so that people want to see fruit, right? All my people, it's easier if we see tangible proof. If I say to them, your suffering will give you a bigger cup. Your suffering will give you a bowl. Your suffering, the more you suffer willingly, you're getting a barrel and whatever, and you'll still be filled to capacity when you get to have. I mean, that is the best analogy. I'd never heard that.
Yeah.
So that
Yeah.
is,
And you will be perfectly satisfied that with your thimble filled
yeah.
with the beatific vision. But the glory that awaits us, the glory that, that awaits us on the other side could be greater to the extent that we fully conform ourselves and expand the interiority to become like Christ, to become like Christ.
So
Here,
what, go ahead.
here's two quotes I want to do. One is, well, again, I mentioned Germany. I was in Germany and I flew all the way over there. The first day was going to be training priest, but they offered a Zoom session and nobody came because they were all afraid. And the organizer said, I said, why did no priests come? I mean, Germany's it's no bigger than, I don't know, Indiana or something. It's not a huge state. I mean, geographically. And they said, well, they're afraid. They're nervous about being seen. There's a lot of, anyway, it's a mess over there. The church is a
Yeah, it
mess.
is.
And um, so I said, you know what? I've come all the way over here. I'm air sick, car sick, grumpy. I said, all right. I said, I'm going to tell you guys, you want to help your country in Germany? I told him the story of Edith Stein. I was actually at the place. I sat at the monastery where Edith Stein would go before she discerned her vocation. Edith Stein was a famous philosopher. She entered into Mount Carmel as a Carmelite, took on the name Teresa Benedicta of the Cross because of her influence at Buron Abbey, the Benedictine Abbey there. I sat in one of the old monks, said this is where she used to sit. I sat in that pew and I started crying. And I'm not a crying guy. I'm not one of those guys. You know what I mean? I just don't cry. It busted me up. It did. Just to see somebody, a martyr, to sit where they prayed. I mean, in living memory of my life. I mean, she was martyred in Auschwitz. As she was being taken away to Auschwitz, she says to her sister, come, Rosa, let us die for our people. I said this, I told these priests, I didn't call them you bunch of wimps. I just said, look,
Not
if you want to
directly.
help your country, you want to help the church, come, Rosa, let us die for our people. And the last word she was recorded, she was on a cattle car, packed in. I mean, you've seen the
Oh,
images.
yeah.
And she was standing there like this, and one of her friends saw her, and she was joyful, and she said, I'm going eastward. And that's the last recorded words that she was taken away. And so eastward, of course,
It's to Christ. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, exactly. To the rising of the sun, the Oriens, And I said, this is what we're called to do. You want to help the church in Germany? You got to become like Christ. You got to go eastward. You got to die for your people. But here's what Edith Stein said. She was a Carmelite nun and died in Auschwitz. And this is one of the things that she wrote. When someone desires to suffer, it is not merely a pious reminder of the suffering of the Lord. Voluntary expiatory suffering. That's a packed theological phrase. Voluntary means I do it of my will. Expiatory means it helps expiate. It helps.
Yeah.
It offers satisfaction for.
Right.
And so my voluntary suffering is expiatory. It offers satisfaction for. Not that Christ needs it, but he asked for it. His
Right.
side was left open for our participation. It is truly what really unites one to, it is what truly and really unites one to the Lord intimately, because she said, Christ the head effects expiation in those members of his mystical body who put themselves, body and soul, at his disposal for carrying out his work of redemption. And so they put themselves, that's what the vocation of the Carmelite is. Read John of the Cross or read Teresa Benedicta of the Cross, Edith Stein, her Science of the Cross, understanding the inner mystical logic of suffering. There's, as we would say, there's gold in them, there are hills, and we ignore it because we recoil against it as part of our own concupiscence, our own fallen human nature. It goes against our fallen human nature, the idea of suffering.
Do you remember a moment where, so now you're working with Father Chad Ripperger, the exorcist, you're doing your own writing, you've obviously been studying this for years as just part of living what you do. Was there a moment for you where suffering became less because you understood it and accepted it more, though, even though the flame got turned up and like you
Yeah.
intellectually knew it was greater suffering, but it was less suffering because of that? Any personal story there?
Yeah, there's always those moments, each in our own personal history, where life, it's just a gut shot, you know. And so I understood all this intellectually, but experiencing suffering in my own life, and then walking people that are afflicted by evil spirits, walking them and teaching them how to use their suffering. That this is when it began to shift, and to see how effective. Because by the end, when you're walking somebody, it's not a quick fix. It's not like, a couple prayers, 2 or 3 weeks, and they're free. No,
Right.
it takes years sometimes to really free someone, because you've got to disentangle their own psychological enmeshment, this psychological compatibility with the demon. And so how do you break that? Through suffering. And so you've got this psychological, this fallen human with wounded psychological trauma, and a fallen angel with wounded psychological trauma. And the principle of like unto like begins to work. And so whatever defect you have at the human level is now being attracted, is very attractive to. It becomes an elixir towards a demon of that category, of that the nature of his fall. And so it breaks through suffering when you get out of the subjective realm into the objective, and offering that suffering with Christ. When you start, offering your suffering up for the very person
That's causing
who
the
hurt you,
suffering.
that caused the suffering, when you can offer that suffering up. So by the end, after months and sometimes years of work, the possessed person is the holiest person in the room, including the priests, because they've truly lived a Christ-like life, and they've
And
learned
you've
to use
seen
it.
this.
Oh, absolutely, time and time again. I've received 1,000 times more graces than I've ever put into this ministry and helping people. It's amazing to see the grace. It's kind of like the analogy Father Ripperger uses. We're kind of like cosmic garbage men, if you will. It's kind of like the dirty jobs of the church.
Hmm.
And so you can, oftentimes in dealing with this and exorcism, these things, it's like being on the receiving end of a sewage pipe. And it's sewage, it's garbage, it's
Yeah,
cosmic garbage, it's
quite the
psychological
visual.
garbage, it's spiritual garbage. But every once in a while, there was a lady up there on the 14th floor apartment that accidentally dropped her wedding ring into the sink, and it goes flying out, and it sparkles as it falls on the ground, and you pick it up, and you've got this 2 carat, perfectly shaped diamond ring, VVG, whatever the ratings are.
Hmm.
Wow. So every once in a while you get these golden nuggets, and it's no longer theory. When you're dealing with this, it's no longer theory. It becomes something that becomes dimensional. Like, wow, yeah, this actually works. This isn't theory. I'm not speaking to you as a theologian. I'm speaking to you as someone who works as a lay associate very closely with priests and this particular ministry. And we see it again and again, the holiness.
Wow. I mean, we could talk about this forever, I suppose. This has been, in my opinion, the richest conversation we've had. And you've talked about a lot of good things because it's so powerful. It's so pertinent. And you brought it down to the everyday, whether someone right now is suffering from a car accident or just a loneliness, or sitting in a nursing home or whatever. There's this value. I think people have just pulled their own diamond rings out of the sewage of their lives, listening to this, going, this is shiny. This
Yeah.
is,
Yeah. We're all going through our Shawshank Redemption moment, that how he broke out of the prison by going
yeah,
down the sewage pipe, that's what suffering is like. We're there, but we're on the path to freedom, you know.
yeah,
That's the thing, is that in our suffering, the more we suffer, and I'm not talking about self-hatred, self-flagellation. I'm talking about conforming our wills to whatever God puts before us, whatever situation we find ourselves in, and allowing him to mine all the possible graces that are embedded into this situation and into this suffering. Mine all the graces out, and don't let those go to waste. Don't let those be wasted. It's like I've used the analogy, you see these movies and they call it a football, they've got a suitcase and they could blow up an entire city block with this suitcase
hmm,
with whatever they put in the
yeah,
movies this little bit of C4 can blow up a whole city, whatever. Um, this is what, when God gives you that cross, if you keep that contained, you're not letting the graces fly out. You have God has given you the ability to really become his associate, to enter into the salvific mystery in a mystical way that is, again, it's not just up in your head, it's something that you engage bodily, like St. Paul says.
Wow. Well, okay. I guess I have to just simply ask you this question because I have to keep going on. So name one thing you'd have our listeners do differently as a result
Okay,
of something they
let me
heard
give you
today.
2 basic prayers. They're in the book. They were written by my good friend.
And
my
again, we're
mentor,
talking about, hold up the book. You're talking about the Liber
oh,
Christo method,
Leo Christo method. I can send
right?
you a link. It might
Yeah.
be in
And we actually posted a link right here.
Okay.
Yeah.
So 2 prayers that Kyle Clement, my good friend and mentor, he's Father Ripperger's right-hand man for the last 20 years or more. 2 prayers that will help us. Number 1 is the Light of Christ prayer. These are functional prayers. Okay. Everything we're talking kind of theoretical, but these are functional. So first of all, I drove by a Baptist church once and it said, the sign outside said, most of us want to serve God, but only in an advisory capacity. Okay, very true. We want to advise you. I want to be his consultant, like fix my wife, fix my husband, fix my kids, fix my job, and help me make more money,
And do it this way.
do it this way. And if you could do it, kind of speed things up, I'd appreciate it if you could get it done by tomorrow, because I want to go out with my buddies on, golfing Saturday, whatever.
That's right. That's right.
So the first one is the Light of Christ prayer. May the light of Christ be upon may the light of Christ be upon me, or be upon my husband. Okay. May the light of Christ be upon my husband, or upon my child, upon my employer, whatever, that they see themselves as the Heavenly Father sees them, and that I see them as the Father sees them. So we're breaking out of this back brain stuff, big picture, and we're asking God to put the light of Christ so I can see this situation with sanctified vision, with the vision of the Father, how the Heavenly Father sees this person. Help me to see the situation. Help them to see themselves in the light of the Father's love. Because ultimately, every bad situation we have, it's ultimately a rejection or a lack of appropriation of the love of the Father for us. And the second prayer is the judo prayer. So all these huge concepts can be broken down in functional ways, the judo prayer. Because judo, you use somebody's force against them. They come running at you, you use their bodily force to throw them on the ground and toss them and do
Oh,
other
I thought it was
things.
a karate chop. It's not.
No, judo is it's a grappling. It's like jujitsu. So the judo prayer, they come at you, you take their momentum against you, you throw them onto the ground, and then you choke them and do other mean things to them. That's judo. Okay. The judo prayer is like this. So when you're getting hit with something, whether it's a negative thoughts or bodily pain or a headache or whatever, Lord, I'm experiencing X, a headache. Lord, I'm experiencing feelings of shame. Lord, I can't sleep and I'm having crazy thoughts right now. Lord, I'm fatigued, back pain, neck pain. Lord, I'm experiencing fear, worry, whatever your X is, put it there. If this is not from you and is diabolic in its source, I ask you to send it back to its source with a tenfold blessing, because it could just be a headache. I've had, sometimes you just get a headache. Okay. So it could just be a physiological headache. Go take aspirin, you feel better. So if this is not from you and is diabolic in source, send it back to its source with a tenfold blessing. So if it's diabolic, you're asking him to send it back. It might be natural, and then you just have to bear the cross. It's a natural suffering. But if you want me to carry this cross, I willfully accept it. I ask you for the grace to carry it, and I offer it up for this person. Yeah. So it's a quick little prayer. I've had days, I had a time, I had like a headache for like a day and a half, and here I am, I wrote the book on this stuff, and I was like, man, I got this headache, it won't go away. And then maybe I ought to pray the judo prayer. Lord, I got a headache. And if this is not from you, is diabolic in origin, send it back to its source with a tenfold blessing. But if you want me to carry this cross, I willfully accept this headache. I ask you for the grace to carry it, and I offer it up for whatever, my pastor, my spouse, my children, whatever. Within 10 minutes, it was gone. Because you're now, the last thing the demon wants to do is participate in voluntary expiatory suffering. The last thing, it goes against the very intellectual matrix of his broken, fallen mind to offer suffering up vicariously for others. And so if he's projecting and pounding you, and you offer this judo prayer up, he often will leave. He'll leave and find a softer target. It's a powerful way to appropriate all the things that we've talked about today, the judo prayer.
Is that in the book too?
It's in the book too.
Yeah. What page is that on?
Oh, I don't memorize
Okay,
it.
we'll look it up. We'll look it up. The
Yeah, I'll look it
Tito.
up and put it on there for you.
No,
Yeah.
I'll find it myself. I'm not that lazy. I just thought maybe you
Yeah.
had it memorized
Yeah.
because you
It's
have a
in the
lot of your
section
pages
on,
memorized.
yeah, it's in the section on trauma. How to deal with trauma. How do we deal with these psychological traumas? Learning to use them as a force for good. So when you receive projections, garbage, whatever, wounds, whatever, that when the demon brings them up to your mind, sending them back with a redemptive act, offering up for that person, particularly if you offered up for your husband, and it's hard to do, the one who's hurt you, the one you're mad at, offering up those little things. This is the essence. It's small things. It's not these huge concepts.
Hmm. So much. I was just thinking of another question, but I'm looking at my clock going, stop with your questions, Christine. We can do them separately. But
Yeah,
that
yeah.
you are always such a blessing. I mean, I'm going to ask my viewers to pray for you that we get this hedge of protection around you because you're writing on this stuff. You're writing a book now. I know it's not going to be out for a while because you only have about 80,000 words at this point, right?
Yeah,
So you
right.
got to siphon this puppy down. Is this a good time to mention? We'll do a show about it when it's done, but what are you writing
Yeah,
about
for
now?
sure. I'm doing a follow-up book on the bigger picture. I'm gonna look at exorcism in the New Testament. So I'm walking through the Gerasene demoniac. As you walk through the New Testament, you start to see Jesus going into Gentile territories, and then there's a young girl, my little daughter, says a Greek woman who is afflicted by demons, and presumably she's 12-ish years old. From Scripture you can argue that, and then Jesus comes across a young father whose boy was possessed by a demon. It says since infancy. So I'm kind of how could that happen? I can understand these things, but how could you have
That
somebody
one.
possessed since infancy? So I'm getting into the concept of inherited guilt, generational sin, that sort of thing. Kind of a thorny topic that I'm trying to bring some clarity to as we see it in the field as well. So I'm going to do a topical view of exorcism and the Old Testament, prefiguring what happens in the New Testament in the life of Jesus.
Oh, good. And I bet we have to wait a while. It's coming out in 2024.
Probably 20, early 2025 is my hope.
All
Yeah.
right. Well, we're going to pray that you get that done
It's going
sooner.
to take me a few more months to get it polished up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to pray lots of prayers that you can get some good writing time in there. Because these things are
Good. Don't,
brain.
yeah, yeah. Well, don't pay too many because then good writing time means I get a broken leg or something. So, yeah, I'm kidding. Yeah,
But
but
you're
I
going to
appreciate
offer
it.
it up.
Yeah, for sure. Right. Yeah. So
Awesome.
no, but yeah, it's a great topic. What we talked about today. I'm glad you brought me on. I think a good follow up is okay. Let's talk about the interior self. How do we shore up? How does prayer? Uh, um, what are the effects of prayer? How do we use prayer? Why we should pray? Most Christians don't pray. Really, we think. I love your podcast. I've got a podcast. Other great podcasts out there. That's not prayer. Reading about prayer isn't prayer. Praying is prayer. So what does it mean? How do we connect with God through prayer?
So is that
It's
next
very,
month's show?
you bet. Let's do
You
it.
heard it first here, people. We're going to talk about prayer and really shoring ourselves up because my prayer life used to be really, really good. And now it's more robotic. And I've actually been asking the Lord, how do I find this balance? Because I go to mass. And anyway, so we'll save that for next month.
You got it.
But how can
Perfect.
our viewers find you? Or do you not want them to find you? I know that they can find your writing, but you just said you had a podcast. So how do they find
Yeah,
you?
I do a podcast every Wednesday with Jesse Romero called Liber Christo War College. We kind of go into spiritual combat a little bit. We've got some informational videos up on liberchristo.org. No, yeah, .org. So informational videos up there as well. But I've got some videos out there with Virgin Most Powerful Radio and War College, Liber Christo War College. You can catch some of the stuff we put out there as well.
And we'll put the links right below here.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you can ask questions there, and I'm guessing they can post comments or get a hold of you through that.
Yep.
Excellent, excellent. And you guys know you can find me at breakfastwithbacon.com. Also start subscribing to Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and then really start looking more on that other place, that Rumble place, because I'm starting to do more topics that I won't be able to air here because the communistic censorship is too much. And I don't know if that's going to get me censored just for saying that, but things that aren't allowed here, you're going to hear them there. So I say this frequently. Don't be a passive recipient of information, sitting there scrolling, waiting for something to pop up on your screen. Subscribe to those people like Dr. Dan Schneider here, and hopefully me and others, where you're going, I need to find out what they're saying now? Who are their guests now? Because the time will come, and it will be very shortly, where everyone that you want to hear is not being sent to you. And so the powers that be are trying to silence the voices of truth. So go after the voices of truth yourself. So again, subscribe Breakfast with Bacon. I'd be very honored, and share this with a friend or two, because again, it's the only way we can get these messages out. Dan, you remember how I end, right? Because you're
I
just
do.
that smart kind of guy. All right.
Yeah.
All right, let's do it. I am Dr.
Okay.
Christine Bacon. Thanks, guys, for watching Breakfast with Bacon. And I'd like to remind you always to live your life
Sunny side up.
the
Got
best
it.
guests ever.